everybody. I am Cappy Powell, and I'm president of the Johann Fust Library Foundation. Welcome all of you to the Johann Fust Library Foundation's 2026 Literature in the Courtyard program. Literature in the Courtyard was first presented 5 years ago, and it is thanks to the generosity of Cotton Hanley, who endows this special event for us. Cotton was a longtime board member and served as foundation president from 2004 to 2008. Her gift has helped us to bring some prominent writers to the Courtyard. Previous Literature in the Courtyard speakers were Hampton Sides, Sally Bedell Smith, Anna Quinlan, and Tom McQuain. Today, thanks to Cotton, and with all of your annual support, we are pleased to have Todd Purdum here today. Todd is a graduate of Princeton University and is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. But previously, he worked, among other places, at the New York Times and served as a White House correspondent. He has written a book about the political battle to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act and one about the war in Iraq. And then he pivoted, I think, because the following two books followed. One was Something Wonderful, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution. And today we will hear about his book, Desi Arnaz, The Man Who Invented Television. As most of you hopefully know by now, throughout this season, the Johann Fust Library Foundation is celebrating the 75 years since Roger and Louise Amory opened the doors to this library in January 1951. If you haven't seen our Island book notes yet, our annual literary publication, the cover celebrates the 75 years of the literary leadership of the foundation. Cotton, thank you again for all your contributions to the library. Todd, it is a complete coincidence that we invited you here today. We didn't realize then that I Love Lucy also originated in 1951. So 1951 was a very good year. Thank you for coming from Los Angeles to help us celebrate our 75 years, and we look forward to hearing about Desi Arnaz and how he revolutionized television 75 years ago.
Thank you so much, Cappy and Cotton and all my generous hosts, Mike and Linda and George and Liz Stevens. And I got a visit today with Tom and Meredith Brokaw, so it's a real pleasure to be here. 75 is a nice round number, and I'm happy to be having the serendipitous simultaneous celebration of your anniversary and the anniversary of I Love Lucy, which will turn 75 this coming October 15th. Can you all hear me okay? I just want to make sure that... So you all know Desi Arnaz. He's Ricky Ricardo, the spluttering Cuban band leader who was forever telling his zany red-haired wife that she had some splainin' to do. He was, as his friend the dancer Ann Miller put it, one of the great personalities of all time. But what you may not know is that Desi Arnaz was much, much more than Ricky Ricardo. He was raised as a prince in pre-revolutionary Cuba, but his family lost everything in the overthrow of the American-backed regime of Gerardo Machado in 1933. And fled to Miami, where he wound up penniless. He reinvented himself as a self-taught musician and wound up playing in a small combo in a hotel in Miami Beach where he was spotted by the king of the rumba, Xavier Cugat, the Spanish-born Cuban-raised bandleader, who promptly took him up to New York to the Waldorf Astoria, where he became a sensation. Cugat then fronted a small band for him that went back to Miami, and on New Year's Eve 1937, Desi was trying to make sense of this motley crew of musicians, which didn't really know any Latin music at all. So he remembered from growing up in Santiago de Cuba, the second largest city on the island, the annual dance at carnival time, the conga, which is a simple 1, 2, 3 kick dance. So he went to the kitchen, grabbed some frying pans and a block of wood, gave all the musicians a swig of rum and took them out into the nightclub, and they started dancing a conga line that eventually wound out into the street. It became a huge sensation. He was spotted by the Broadway songwriting team of Rodgers and Hart, who brought him to New York again to star in their musical. And when the movie version of that musical got made in 1940, Desi came to Hollywood, where he met a contract actress who had already made 60 films. Her name was Lucille Ball, and the rest is history. They got married after a whirlwind courtship and spent 10 years in dueling careers. She increasingly as the so-called queen of the B movies, the second feature and a double feature. And he is an itinerant band leader who was always on the road and faithful to Lucy only in his fashion. They mostly met at dawn or dusk at the top of Coldwater Canyon when she was on her way home from work and he was on his way to the nightclub or vice versa. And by the end of that decade, both their careers and their marriage were severely on the rocks. But in 1950, the summer of 1950, one glimmer of hope appeared. Lucy had started a network radio sitcom called My Favorite Husband in the last golden days of network radio. And this involved a housewife who had all sorts of schemes and dreams and was married to the 5th vice president of a bank. So as television was coming on strong, CBS wanted to transfer the show to television, but Lucy only wanted to do it if Desi could play her husband, partly because she wanted to keep him at home where she could keep an eye on him. And CBS said, there's no way that you can play this part, and even Desi realized he couldn't really play the 5th vice president of a bank. And CBS said, no one will believe that you, this thick-accented Cuban, are married to an all-American red-headed girl. And his answer was, we have actually been married for 10 years. But so there was one plan that he had. He went around the network executives and came up with the idea of taking him and Lucy on a vaudeville tour of major movie houses around the country where they would do a music and comedy act. He would sing and play the drum and work with his combo, and she would do comedy and sing comic songs. Well, they were a sensation from New York to Chicago, all across the country. And finally, the network executives at CBS and one advertising man named Milton Beo, who was actually the grandfather of the actor Matthew Broderick, and represented Philip Morris, said, we'll take a chance on this. And they came up with a scenario in which Desi would be what he really was in real life, a band leader, and his wife, Lucy, would be a housewife who wanted nothing so much as a career in show business when all Ricky wanted to do was keep her at home. And it was Desi Arnaz who became not only the co-star of the show, but the driving force behind getting it on the air. It quickly, despite all the skepticism, became the #1 show on television, and it stayed that way for most of the 1950s. And it was not only the #1 show, but a nationwide phenomenon. At 1/4 the hour, at 9 o'clock Eastern Time Zone, water pressure in cities all over the country decreased because people were going to the bathroom at the one break of the show. In the fall of 1952, a church bulletin in Indianapolis invited people to a Monday night prayer service and told them they could be home for 2/3 of I Love Lucy if they came to pray for the boys in Korea. And in 1953, a newly minted graduate of the University of Southern California in Los Angeles named Rosalind Wyman, who was running to become the youngest ever member of the LA City Council, went canvassing for votes on Monday nights because she knew people would be home watching the show. She won. And then she helped bring the Dodgers to LA, which is a great, big, wonderful story in LA and a terrible story in Brooklyn. But in the fall of 1954, on the eve of I Love Lucy's 4th season on the air, Ed Sullivan devoted an entire episode of his Sunday night show to paying tribute to I Love Lucy. And Lucy gave an emotional speech in which she recognized just how much Desi had done to make her one of the most famous women in the world. Desi himself ended the evening with an emotional tribute in which he talked about how only in America could a Cuban immigrant whose first job was cleaning bird cages in pharmacies in Miami Beach become a star of television and a major success in business. The interesting thing about it is that gratitude was mutual, because against all the odds in Eisenhower-era America, when diversity was not really an issue and television was an overwhelmingly monochromatic business, Desi became a beloved figure in American life, almost as much as his wife. What people may not understand as much, it was really Desi Arnaz who assembled the world-class team of talent that arranged to film I Love Lucy in sequence, like a little play, in front of 3 cameras at once, in front of a live audience. Pardon me, and it was his decision to do this and to preserve the show on pristine 35mm film stock is why we can still see it today, looking so beautiful like a little motion picture. It was also his insistence on owning the rights to that film that became the foundation of the Desilu empire that ultimately made them, by the end of the 1950s, the largest producer of television content in the world, and helped spark the transfer of the television business from New York, where it had been centered, to Los Angeles, where it remains today. And that's why I stole a line from NPR's Planet Money to subtitle my book, The Man Who Invented Television, because it was really Desi's insistence on these developments that made him not only the first Latino television executive, but really the most senior one to this day. Shortly before his death, the great Norman Lear told me that Desi was a great businessman in the persona of a wonderful entertainer. There's no doubt about that. Ultimately, Desilu became the studio that hosted the shows of Danny Thomas, Annie Griffith, Dick Van Dyke, and many others. And the Desilu Talent Pool was an alumni club that went on to be among the most influential people in television. Jay Sandrich, who'd cut his teeth as an assistant director on I Love Lucy, became the director of The Mary Tyler Moore Show and The Cosby Show. Quinn Martin, who'd been a Desilu sound engineer and editor, became the producer of the FBI and Barnaby Jones and all those police procedurals. And Aaron Spelling, who went on to do The Love Boat and Charlie's Angels and all those shows in the 1970s that were called Jiggle Television, started as a bit actor on an I Love Lucy episode. In the nearly 75 years since the show's debut, it's been seen in 80 countries, in 20 languages by more than 1 billion people. In the 1980s, TV Guide judged that Lucille Ball's face had been seen more often by more people than the face of any human being who ever lived. At the beginning of the 21st century, an episode was playing every hour of every day somewhere in the world. And their images are on lunchboxes, salt and pepper shakers, tea towels, pajamas, clocks, Christmas ornaments, and the postage stamps of multiple countries. And even today, as George pointed out to me a few years ago, on the honey wagons, the portable toilet trailers that are on movie locations, the restrooms are labeled not men and women, but Desi and Lucy, and everyone knows what they mean. Lucille Ball's incredible comic genius has everything to do with that, of course, but so does Desi Arnaz's singular vision and courage. How he pulled that off is as good as any story he ever produced, but it definitely takes some splaining. He was born in March of 1917 to an aristocratic Cuban family. His father was the son of a doctor who, family lore held it, had run up San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War. Desi Arnaz's father, also known as Desiderio, was the longtime reform-minded mayor of Santiago, the second largest city on the southeastern coast of the island. And Desi's mother was the daughter of a senior Bacardi rum executive who was once judged one of the dozen most beautiful women in Latin America. By every indication, he had a childhood that was on the track to making him spoiled rotten. He'd hoped to come to the United States to go to law school and go to college at Notre Dame, and the odds are we would never have heard of him again. But in 1933, the government of Cuba was overthrown. The Arnaz family fled to Florida, and Desi, with a $5 guitar, started playing in bands. And as I said, he was spotted by Xavier Cugat and ultimately went to Broadway. And the first movie that he made, the first play that he was in on Broadway, Too Many Girls, was a story about college football by Rodgers and Hart. And as Desi later said, it was about football and college and sex. And Lucille Ball was hired to play the ingenue part in the movie. Desi later had to suffer the fact that Lucy said Too Many Girls became the story of his whole life, because he, at the time they met, he was actually dating Betty Grable. She was living with and dating an older director named Alexander Hall, but they promptly broke up with their existing boyfriends and got married. And they set up housekeeping in the San Fernando Valley in a little 5-acre ranchito that they dubbed Desilu, a combination of their names, that the playwright Thornton Wilder said sounded like the past participle of a French verb. From the beginning, they had a tempestuous and loving relationship and constant battles, mostly over Desi's infidelity. And also, as the 1940s wore on, he faced headwinds in Hollywood. There weren't that many parts for a thick, accented Latino actor. He once said he didn't want to be the Latin lover type. He would have much rather been a Cuban Mickey Rooney, a sort of triple threat who could do comedy, drama, sing, and dance. And he had a few good parts, but he struggled. He really struggled. He never got in the top rank of stars. And when one of his movies, a war movie called The Navy Comes Through, starring Pat O'Brien and George Murphy, premiered, Desi had spent all day polishing his Buick Roadmaster, and when they went to the premiere that night, the valet said, "Miss Ball's car, please." So he said, "This is enough. I'm going back on the road with my band." Ultimately, he got drafted and was assigned during the war to entertain troops stateside at hospitals in the San Fernando Valley. And Lucy's career was going a little better, but she too was experiencing a lot of frustration because she never managed to go into the front rank of stars in Hollywood. She was working in a lot of movies. She had little parts in big movies, big parts in smaller movies, but she was never making the A-list. And because she realized that Desi was playing around with all these chorus girls while he was doing his entertaining the troops, she decided in the middle of the war that she was actually going to divorce him. But on the night before her court appearance, he called and said, "What are you doing?" She said nothing particular, so they went to dinner and wound up in bed. And the next morning, she got up to go to the courthouse. He said, "Where are you going?" She said, "I bought a new suit. I'm going to divorce you." But she came back home and promptly got back in bed, thus invalidating the provisional decree under California law. So as a means of keeping Desi at home, Lucy helped, she persuaded Bob Hope to hire him as the house band leader for his weekly radio show sponsored by Pepsodent. And this was a good gig for Desi, and he absorbed enormous lessons about showmanship, comedy timing, and how to make a weekly show. But he also had to be the butt of sometimes truly cringy jokes. There was one episode when the singer Martha Tilton was a guest, and Bob asked her how she kept her throat in good shape. And she said, "Oh, you know, we all use atomizers and things like that. We spray our throats." He said, "Yeah, Desi tried that. The beans got through okay, but the chili clogged up the atomizer." And that's the kind of stuff he had to put up with. But while this was happening, he was really getting a college education in the art of comedy. So when CBS said, "We want Lucy to make the television show," Desi had a few aces up his sleeve. And he went around, as I said before, the backs of the network leadership to engineer this deal in which they basically persuaded people by going directly to the public that the audiences would buy them as a team. So CBS agreed to put the show in the air. Philip Morris was the sponsor. But people were so skeptical about Desi's talents in the beginning that there was a clause in the contract that Ricky could only sing if it was absolutely essential to the plot. So the writers were careful to work that into the early episodes, and then of course when the show became a success, that clause was dropped. But the second problem that arose was CBS promptly called and said, "Okay, when are you moving to New York?" Because television was centered in New York, it was a sponsor-driven business. And at that time, there was not yet a way to broadcast a signal all the way across the country because there was no coaxial cable. So a show that originated in New York could make it about as far west as Kansas City. And if you did a show in Los Angeles, the only way it could be seen in the 2/3 of the country where most of the audience was by filming it in 16mm film off a television monitor, producing a really cruddy copy called a kinescope. And that would have to be shipped by air freight and shown as much as a week later. So CBS said, no way are we going to make the dominant audience of the country see a show that is a week later, and that is a very poor copy. So that led Desi to say, what if we film the show in Los Angeles instead? And CBS said, that's all right, but it's going to cost more. And because they were in the 90% tax bracket, we think we have high taxes, we do not compared to what people paid. Desi agreed because it wouldn't really be a big after-tax loss. But he had one proviso, he wanted to own the negative. And neither he nor CBS fully realized at the time just how valuable that would be. But it ultimately is the secret that allowed I Love Lucy to popularize the rerun and syndication and the whole rise of the modern business model of television. The next wrinkle was that CBS insisted on a live audience because Lucy had always done best on the radio show with a live audience to play off. And that meant finding a way to turn a motion picture soundstage, which is a working factory floor with lights and cables and fire hazards, into an auditorium. So they devised a system of wood and metal bleachers that could seat up to 300 people. They cut a large door in the side of the soundstage. In Los Angeles, you can still see the plaster is still scarred where the door was cut in Hollywood, so that the audience could file in and out. And they decided that the best way to capture the spontaneity of the comedy was to use 3 cameras in synchronization at once to capture the action and the reaction at the same time. So they had the plan, but then they went to one of the leading cinematographers in Hollywood, a man named Karl Freund, who was a German emigre, weighed about 300 pounds, came to work every day with a briefcase full of martinis. And he said, you can't possibly do it. And Desi said, why? He said, because you can't light adequately for the close-up, the long shot, the medium shot, and get a good picture all at once. Freund, as an intellectual challenge, took on the job, and he came up with a system of so-called flat overhead lighting that would light the set in a uniform way that could make the filming workable. So they found 2 other actors, the brilliant William Frawley and Vivian Vance, to play the neighbors. And one of the secrets of the show was that its plot lines were not in any way topical. You would never know that Harry Truman was president, that the Korean War was going on. These were episodes about the stuff of life: jealousy, rivalry, avarice, friendship, betrayal, marital tensions. And that's one of the reasons that the show endures today and seems so fresh and funny. Desi very quickly proved himself a capable performer. Everyone remembers the chocolate episode where Lucy and Ethel are trying. But what people tend to forget is that the flip part of that episode was that Ricky and Fred say, we can take care of the household chores and we will make dinner. So Fred makes a 7-layer cake that's about as thick as an LP record. And Desi then asks, I'm going to make my favorite dish, arroz con pollo. How much rice do you think we should cook? And Fred says, I don't know, but it was thrown at me on one of the darkest days of my life. And Desi said, well, how about a pound per person? And Fred says, that sounds about right. So the next thing you see there in the kitchen, and the chickens are in a pressure cooker, and the pressure cooker explodes, and the chickens come to the ceiling, and then the pot of rice begins to overflow all over the kitchen floor. And they had never rehearsed the scene with real rice until they were filming the episode. And halfway through the sequence, Desi fell, ass over tea kettle, on the floor, and he realized he was getting such a huge laugh from the live audience that he contrived to fall 2 more times, accidentally on purpose, before the scene had ended. So everything was going swimmingly, but then in the spring of 1952, Lucy came to Desi with what she thought was good news, that she was pregnant with their second child. Their daughter Lucy had been born in July of 1951, just before the show went on the air. But this prompted a crisis because in 1950s America, no pregnant actress had ever been on television and no pregnant character had ever been in a show. Because if you showed a pregnant woman, you'd have to think about how she got pregnant, and that involved something that wasn't talked about on television. So CBS and the sponsor said, there is no way that you can have this be part of the show, which might have canceled the show after its first season. But Desi and the showrunner, Jess Oppenheimer, the producer, the head writer, were firm in their belief that this could make a wonderful, touching plot line with all sorts of episodes about what happens when people have a baby. CBS was totally adamant, so Desi once again went above the heads of the suits. He wrote directly to the chairman of Philip Morris and said, we've given you the #1 show on television, and if you don't want us to be responsible for it anymore, you'll have to take charge of it yourself. And suddenly, the opposition to the pregnancy theme dissipated completely. Desi only found out a couple years later when he went to visit Philip Morris, and the chairman's secretary showed him a memo that Alfred Lyon had written to his staff saying, don't fool around, in more pungent terms, with the Cuban. So to make sure that all these episodes were done in impeccable taste, they hired a tripartite advisory board of a Catholic priest, a rabbi, and a Protestant minister to advise on all the scripts. And they thought it was wonderful, and the clergymen became friends after every Friday night's filming, and they would go out to dinner. There was another problem, though, because the censors wouldn't let them say the word pregnant. So Desi quickly realized that it was better for him to say spectin anyway, because it got a better laugh than you could get with pregnant. And really one of the most moving episodes of the whole series is when Lucy is trying to tell Ricky that she's going to have a baby. And she can't find a private moment to do it, so she goes to the nightclub, passes a note to the maitre d' saying, not putting her name on it, saying, I'm going to have a blessed event, and I'd like to, this would be my way of telling my husband. So anyway, Desi suddenly realizes that it's her. He bursts into song. He sings this song. And when the episode aired the following January, 1953, because Lucy's first baby had been born by cesarean section, the doctors arranged for her second one to be born the same way. So on the morning of January 19th, 1953, Desi Arnaz Jr. was born in real life at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in LA, and Ricky Ricardo Jr., little Ricky, was born on television that night. And about 15 million more people watched that show, 70% of all the TV sets in use in the country, then watched Dwight Eisenhower be inaugurated the next morning. Years later, when the president met Desi Jr. in a golf course in Palm Springs, he said, are you that little fellow who knocked me off the front pages? And bought him a banana split. So everything seemed to be going very well. MGM, where both Desi and Lucy had worked in the war, and not very happily, recruited them back to make a feature film, The Long, Long Trailer, which was basically an extended color version of I Love Lucy. And when they went to New York to promote the show, they went to a Broadway show, and suddenly the audience was standing up around them before the curtain in a standing ovation. And Lucy turned to Desi and said, "Eleanor Roosevelt must be here." And then they quickly realized that it was them, that the audience was standing up for them. So because their show had been so successful, all sorts of other actors and producers and creators in Hollywood wanted to know how this three-camera method was done. So they came to Desilu for advice, and Desilu branched out and began being the landlord and the producer of other shows. The sad part about all this is, as their empire began growing, the pressures on Desi accelerated. And I think he would have clearly suffered from what we'd now call undiagnosed PTSD, because as a teenager in Cuba, he'd seen his house destroyed, his neighbors killed, heads on a pike, the kinds of violence that nobody should have to see. And he began a descent into what would become really severe alcoholism. He was drinking at 10 in the morning, and the pressures were too much. But business-wise, the Desilu was going great guns. And in October 1956, Desi and Lucy decided to sell the first 179 episodes of the show back to CBS for about $5 million, which was thought to be an extraordinary deal at the time. And no one yet envisioned the endless market of reruns that was going to happen. And they used that nest egg the following year to buy the old RKO studios where they'd first met. And that, once again, helped prompt them to expand their production further. They became the largest physical production plant of movies in all of Hollywood, and eventually all these other shows were going there. By the mid-1950s, they were producing 295 half hours of television a year. And the backdrop of this was increasing tension in their marriage, because Desi, in addition to his drinking, continued his philandering. He didn't, as his daughter Lucille Arnaz told me, have affairs with people whose last names he knew. He just compulsively patronized prostitutes and chorus girls and things like that. They went to seek some marriage counseling, of all places, from the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, who hooked them up with a psychiatrist with the improbable name of Smiley Blanton, who'd been analyzed by Freud himself. And Lucy Arnaz showed me the letters that Dr. Blanton wrote back and forth to Desi, which ultimately involved talking about their golf game. But it was really hard for Lucy and Desi to keep their marriage going in the midst of all this. And the poignant paradox is they'd started the show so that they could be together, but the strain of being together 24/7 at home and work was proving to be too much. In 1959, they had one last big hit. Desi came up with the idea of a crime show based on the life of Eliot Ness and his pursuit of the Al Capone gang in Prohibition-era Chicago. The twist here is that when Desi came to Miami, his best friend in high school had been Al Capone Jr., whose father was at that moment in Alcatraz for tax evasion. But Desi thought this had potential, and so they created a two-part episode that amounted to the first television movie miniseries that was a sensation, and it got picked up by ABC as a weekly series starring Robert Stack, and it prompted the first serious, sustained debate over violence on television, as well as a vigorous debate among Italian Americans about their image in the media, which foreshadowed in some ways the controversy that would happen a decade later with The Godfather. But I Love Lucy couldn't be sustained, and Desi and Lucy filmed the last episode of the series, which by that point had become an occasional hour-long show, in the spring of 1960, and the next day after the episode was filmed, Lucy went to file for divorce, and this time it stuck. Desi wrote in his memoir, which came out in 1976 and was just reissued this week by Lucy Arnaz with a new afterword, that he'd received over the years dozens of letters from viewers who'd thanked him for saving their marriages, because until they saw Lucy and Ricky, they thought their wives were crazy, but they realized that's just how people are. And he said that it was a poignant reality for him that he had not been able to save his own marriage, and he could never write Ricky a thank you note for saving his own. He stayed on it at Desilu and helped Lucy get her second series. The Lucy Show launched in 1962, but it was never really the same. And Lucy wound up buying him out for $3 million, the equivalent of about $30 million today. Happily, both Lucy and Desi got remarried. She to a sort of second-tier nightclub comedian named Gary Morton, whom Desi insisted for the rest of his life, referring to him as Barry Norton, as if he couldn't be bothered to learn his real name. And Desi married a woman named Edie Hirsch, whose husband Clement Hirsch was the king of the Calcan pet food empire. And when they were dating, they started dating while Edie was still married to her husband. And it turns out that both Desi and Clement Hirsch had private eyes tailing the other until they realized this was a serious waste of expense and they should just proceed with the divorce. But Desi acquired a 9-year-old stepson, Edie's son, Greg, who told me in an interview, I said, what kind of a stepfather was he like? And he said he was a wonderful, loving man. And he told the story about how Desi had taken the 3 children, Lucy and Desi Jr. and Greg, deep sea fishing in his boat off Del Mar in Southern California. And Lucy had caught, no tarpon in the South Pacific, in California, but Lucy had caught a marlin. And so Desi promptly raised a blue flag on the boat as to signal that the marlin was the catch. And then Desi Jr. caught a sailfish, which led to the rising of a red flag. And eventually Greg caught a nearly 100-pound wahoo, which is a member of the tuna family, so heavy it broke the rod, and Desi helped him reel it in. But then Greg realized there was no flag for his fish, so he began to cry. And Desi told his wife, Edie, go below and take off your bra. And she said, what? So he raised the bra on the flagpole and said, now when we come into port, they're going to see the blue flag for the marlin, and they're going to see the red flag for the sailfish, and they're going to see your flag, and they're going to wahoo! And that's for your fish. So I think we'd all be grateful to have a stepfather like that. Desi struggled to make a comeback in Hollywood. By that point, he was drinking really severely, that the industry had stopped trusting him. He had one last successful sitcom in the 1960s with Kay Ballard and Eve Arden called The Mothers-in-Law, which ran for 2 seasons on NBC. He published his memoir. He appeared on the first season of NBC's Saturday Night Live. But he was basically on a path to drinking himself to death until finally Desi Jr., who'd had his own teenage struggles with alcohol and drugs, helped him get sober in the last year of his life. And he went to the Scripps Clinic in San Diego and stood up and said, he registered under the name Bill Sanchez, but he stood up and said, my name is Desi and I'm an alcoholic. And he got sober, but within a very short time, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He died in early December of 1986 when he was just 69. And later that same week, Lucy went to Washington to receive the Kennedy Center honors. And Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy were honored at the same ceremony, but Desi was pointedly not part of the evening, although he had been asked to contribute remarks and he'd hoped to come in person. Instead, Robert Stack read a letter that he'd written in which he said he'd been often asked to apportion credit for the show, and his answer was give 90% of the credit to Lucy, the rest of us were just props. But Robert Stack concluded by saying, in Desi's words, P.S., I Love Lucy was never just a title. And the camera cut to Lucy in the balcony next to President Reagan, and she's barely able to control her emotions. So he had a sad end in his personal life in many ways, but the happy part of the end of my book is that his legacy lives on in a very vivid, palpable way. When you watch a sitcom today, odds are that it's filmed in it's on digital tape now, but it's done in very much the same way that I Love Lucy was made 75 years ago. So All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, Cheers, Seinfeld, Friends, Happy Days, all these shows were made with the 3-camera method. Peter Roth, the longtime television executive at Warner Brothers, told me that he would stack any episode of Friends, which was filmed with 3 cameras, up against an episode of Modern Family, which was filmed with a single camera, because nothing could compete with that live audience laughter. And Paul Feig, the comedy director of feature films like The Bridesmaids, still uses multiple cameras, even though the cinematographers hate it because it makes it much harder to set up the shots, because nothing can capture the spontaneity of comedy, action, and reaction quite like simultaneous filming. Desi Jr., I asked him what he thought the show was about, and he said it was about tensions. Only they made up. They didn't hurt each other, but they almost hurt each other every Monday night. And the longtime Desilu executive Martin Leeds said that the secret of the show is that there was nothing Lucy could do that Ricky wouldn't love her. And so we love her too, and I guess we always will. In real life, Desi Arnaz could be a lot harder to love than Ricky Ricardo. He hurt a lot of people, which he ultimately came to acknowledge. But the upside of his profligacy was his generosity, and the flip side of his restlessness was his creativity. And the corollary of his addictions was his incredible drive. He was a genuine original, and for better and worse, he knew it. His friend Rod Rodriguez, the son of a former president of Mexico, said, with all his genius, he possessed an honest heart, honest manners, good sense, and good humor. Yet, as a romanticist, he was one of the most incorrigible human beings that ever lived. If I reminded him of his follies, intending to induce a useful lesson, he would light up at the recollection, retrieving the experience with the fondness that showed he would want nothing better than to do it again. So I'd be delighted to take your questions, and thanks again for having me. It's such a wonderful place to be. I think there are mics being passed around, maybe in the back.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. Does anyone have a question? Julianne's over there. If you...
I don't think anyone would disagree that Lucy and Desi were huge stars, but I think a lot of credit has to go to their writers, and I wonder if you might say a bit about that.
That's a very good question. Yes, indeed. They had for most of the show some combination of the same three writers, the head writer and producer Jess Oppenheimer, and particularly Madeline Pugh and Bob Carroll Jr., who stayed with Lucy in one way or another through all her subsequent shows as well. Madeline Pugh talked about how the secret of the show was that Lucy would do any zany thing they could dream up with, and Desi would pay for it. But the pace they had to keep up in an era when the networks had 39 episodes of fresh shows every year, they said they used to wish that President Truman would make a speech on a Monday night so they could have a week off, because they were frantically trying to keep up. So a lot of the things that we see on the shows that have passed into, folklore, the candy making, the pizza episode where Lucy gets the pizza over and pulls her eyes out. These were things that they noticed walking around. They saw somebody in the farmer's market in Hollywood making candy. They saw a pizza maker in a window in Hollywood doing these things, and they would come up with these ideas, and then Lucy would be willing to do it. Desi was a demon for insisting that the props had to be authentic. So in an episode where the Lucy and Fred and Desi and Ricky and Lucy go deep sea fishing, they initially had a rubber prop tuna. And Desi said, this isn't going to cut it. So they sent the prop person down to the San Pedro to the harbor in Los Angeles and got a real tuna that was like, 150-pound tuna, and brought it back, and apparently it was a little odoriferous, but they made it go. In the episode where the long loaf of bread comes out of the oven, they had a bakery in Los Angeles actually bake a loaf of rye bread that would be edible, and they cut it up and gave it to the crew after the scene was filmed. So I think the writers get an enormous amount of credit for coming up with scenarios. And the interesting thing is, the writers also said that Desi had an almost infallible sense of what would work and not work. He couldn't always articulate why he thought it, and that his first reading was excellent. It would never get any better, never get any worse as the week went on, whereas Lucy would often come in and be in a grumpy mood and say, this script isn't funny, and then she would play with her props, work it out, so that by the end of the week, her performance would rise to the heights we now all know. But I think it's important to remember that the writers were a crucial part of their appeal.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you again, Todd, for coming across the country to us.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure.
And for those of us who thought it was all about Lucy, for giving us this book that tells us so much. What was some of your research? I mean, was Lucie Arnaz helpful, and what kind of written sources did you have, or memorabilia?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Yes, I couldn't have written the book without the unstinting support of Lucie Arnaz, who lives in Palm Springs and has in her garage a really well-organized family archive that she had really basically never shared with anyone before. And eventually she asked me to come out there and gave me carte blanche and said, have at it. And it has everything from Desi's high school report card to his medical records to everything in between, and drafts of his memoir and unpublished correspondence. And then the family gave Desi's musical scores and about 80-some scrapbooks to the Library of Congress that Lucy had kept over the years. And Desi's father also compiled 4 scrapbooks in Spanish, recounting his political career in Cuba as well as Desi's entertainment career. So with those primary source materials, I was able to find, telegrams they'd sent each other when they were courting, letters from friends, telegrams from officials, contract material from the network. And without that, I really couldn't have. But the thing that I'm really, really grateful for is the trust that Lucie Arnaz, for whatever reason I still don't quite understand, decided to show in me, because she's the person who, her brother Desi's involved too, but she's really the steward of their legacy. And she is a very diligent steward of it, but she's not hyper-protective, and she's under no illusions about their failings as people and parents. And she basically said, you just have to let the chips fall where they may and tell the truth. And because the last part of Desi's story is in fact sad, I said, how do I handle the third act? And she said, you just tell it like it was. And her reflexive response over the years when people tell her how much they love her mother is to say, I had a father too. And she tells a wonderful story. She's been married for more than 40 years to the actor Larry Luckenbill, and they have 3 children together. And but so for the purposes of repairmen and service people who come to their house, she's Mrs. Luckenbill. And when they lived in New York, the cable went out, and the cable repairman came to fix it. And above their TV set was an oil portrait of Lucille. And he said, oh, gee, that looks just like Lucille Ball. And Lucy said, yeah, that's my mom. To which he replied, well, she looks just like Lucille Ball. And so to be the child of a really world-famous parent is a big obligation, but she's handled it with enormous grace and goodwill. I think there was a question someplace. I saw a raised hand. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Todd, what did you learn about the brilliant casting of Ethel and Fred?
Thank you. It is brilliant casting, and like so many things, we think it's inevitable because it's so perfect. But it wasn't foreordained. Originally, the character actor James Gleason, I don't know how many of you might remember him, he was a wonderful, curmudgeonly guy. He wanted to play the part of Fred, but he wanted $5,000 a week, and Lucy and Desi combined were only making $4,000, so they didn't hire him. William Frawley was interested in the role, and he'd been a character actor kicking around Hollywood and vaudeville forever. As a young performer, he'd helped introduce standards like Caroline in the Morning and My Melancholy Baby, but he had a reputation in Hollywood as a terrible drunk. So Desi took him to lunch at a restaurant called Nicodel and said, listen, if you are indisposed for one time, I'll cover for you, and I'll try to cover the second time, but if you miss anything the third time, I'll not only fire you, I'll make sure you never work in this town again. Whereupon Frawley said, it's a deal. What is this, the Sahara Desert? Waiter, where's the drink? And he never missed any moment, but he had a habit of only reading the pages of the script in which he had lines. So he often didn't understand why things were funny. So there's an episode in which he comes into the room and he says, hello, Ethel. And he doesn't understand why that's funny, but a few pages before, it's been set up that Ethel is dressed in the rear end of a horse costume. And he comes in and sees only the rear end and says, hello, Ethel. And he says, well, that's funny. So Vivian Vance had been a working actress on Broadway. She'd been Ethel Merman's understudy in Anything Goes, and she had performed in a lot of plays. But she'd also had a nervous breakdown and was really a little bit uncertain about whether she wanted to go back to work. And when they came to her with this idea of television, she's like, who wants to go work in television? That's an admission that you're kind of on the skids. But Desi went down to see her in San Diego in a production of a play called The Voice of the Turtle. And he thought she would be just perfect. And of course, in hindsight, they're they're the only people in the whole enterprise who didn't really like each other. Vivian Vance resented having to play the wife of a much older guy. He didn't have any very high regard for her singing or musical talents. And so I think there was a fair amount of tension between the two of them. But the rest of the show was a pretty happy crew. But of course, in hindsight, you can't imagine anyone else playing those parts. It was also somewhat unusual because usually in comedy, the second characters, like in a musical comedy, for example, are usually the younger romantic lovers and the older couple. And so to make the secondary characters the curmudgeonly older couple was a little bit playing with the usual formula, and it worked obviously really well.
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering what possessed you to go from writing about history and politics to enter the entertainment business, and do you think there are any characteristics that successful politicians and successful entertainers share?
Well, to the latter, yes. I mean, Ronald Reagan famously said he didn't see how you could be a politician, how you could be president if you weren't an actor. And he had the famous line in which Scary to sit across from Mikhail Gorbachev? No. Scary to sit across the desk from Jack Warner? Yes. But I wish I could say that I had a highly developed plan when this started, but I started working on the Rodgers and Hammerstein book in 2015, and as Cappy said, I spent most of my journalistic career covering politics. I wish I could say I had a master plan to get out of politics before certain things happened in politics, but I'm glad that I did. And I think the common thread that, they both involve a lot of performative aspects. They both involve a lot of tension and high wire moments. But I think in the end, for me, in the case of Rodgers and Hammerstein, I'd grown up with their music. That's the music my parents played when I was growing up. And the common thread between these two things is Rodgers and Hammerstein were to the Broadway musical the same sort of innovators, both creatively and in terms of their business, that Desi was for television. They contrived to own their intellectual property, to own the rights to their shows, to be in control of them. And in both cases, I was as interested in the story of how they made their businesses as I was in how they made their art. And so I think I'm not sorry that for the past 10 years I haven't had to pay any more attention to politics than I do as a citizen, because that's more than enough right now, I think.
And Todd, what was it that opened the door for you to become so interested in researching Desi Arnaz?
Well, it's interesting. The short answer is I lost my job. In the pandemic, I was involuntarily liberated from my job at The Atlantic, and I was 60 years old, and nothing like that had ever happened to me since I got out of college. In fact, the last job I ever applied for was when I got out of college and I got hired by the New York Times. I had never applied for any other job since. So I called everyone I could think of to ask for advice about writing a book. And one of them was my old college friend, the actor and director and playwright Doug McGrath, who said, everyone thinks of Lucy, but people don't realize how much Desi had to do with the success of the show. And in 2001, on the 50th anniversary of the show, Doug had written a piece. There were twin pieces in the New York Times, one about Lucy and one about Desi, and Doug had written the one about Desi. Sadly, while he was starring in an off-Broadway play directed by John Lithgow, a memoir about his growing up in Midland, Texas, he died at 63 of a heart attack. So I dedicated the book to him, and that's the whole reason I got started on the project. And it took a while. I felt I had a lot of identification with Desi because for a long time, nobody very much believed in it. My wife did, my family, but my agent was like, nobody cares about that. And my previous publisher, whom I owed the right of first refusal, rejected the idea, misspelling my name twice in the letter in which they did so. So my agent, the late Bob Barnett of Washington, said, I could shop this around, but I don't want to disappoint you. I said, Bob, I'm 61 years old. The publisher of the only books I've ever written has rejected my idea, misspelling my name. How much more disappointed could I really get? So I said, why don't you call Jonathan Karp at Simon & Schuster? And it happened that Simon & Schuster had just hired a woman named Mindy Marquez, who'd been the editor of the Miami Herald, who, among other things, supervised their coverage of the Jeffrey Epstein case. And her parents were born in Santiago, Cuba, Desi's hometown. And within about 72 hours, she instantly realized the potential appeal of the story and bought the book. So I owe it to her, too, for understanding it.
And we're lucky you did.
I feel very grateful.
Lucky. This is such an interesting talk. Thank you so much for sharing your book with us and for being here today and for celebrating literature in the garden.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really my pleasure.